Hi, American history students. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Nazi foreign policy and the path into World War II. So really what we're getting up to at this point is what we might identify as the short-term causes of World War II by focusing specifically on the steps that Nazi Germany took in relation to its neighbors and to the outside world in the 6 years or so leading up to the official start of World War II. So Nazi foreign policy, and foreign policy is just a term that is used to describe the way that nations interact with other nations. So Nazi foreign policy was guided by three different goals, three different things that the Nazis wanted, or what we might call their steps. So step one for the Nazis was to protect yourself with alliances. What they wanted to do was to secure their state, to secure their nation state with some strong alliances to protect it against external threats. Germany comes into this, the Nazis come into this not necessarily from a position of strength. They had been stripped by the Treaty of Versailles militarily. They are in the midst of a political crisis. They're in the midst of an economic crisis. So they weren't coming at this from a position of tremendous strength early in the 1930s. So what they wanted to do was to establish these stronger alliances to try to protect themselves. And there were a number of different alliances that the Nazis would make in the mid to late 1930s, beginning with the Nazi Vatican Concordat in 1933. So what we have here is an agreement between the Catholic Church and the Nazis to, sort of stay out of each other's way. In 1939, we have the Pact of Steel, which was an agreement signed, kind of an alliance or a friendship agreement signed by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, by Mussolini and Hitler, and that would form a strong alliance. In fact, that was the alliance at the center of the Axis powers as we move into World War II. And then finally, in that same year, they would sign the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which was more or less an agreement to divide up Poland and stay out of each other's way. So what Germany's trying to do here is to learn from the lessons of World War I and to avoid a multi-front war. Remember, one of the big challenges that Germany faced in World War I was the fact that they ended up fighting a two-front war. The alliance between France in the west and Russia in the east divided German troops and made it virtually impossible for them to kind of achieve any significant victory that they could build on. So this is in many ways an attempt to avoid that. So they're forming these alliances to protect different flanks, if you will, of Germany. Step two of Nazi foreign policy. After you've protected yourself with alliances, they wanted to reject the Treaty of Versailles, or to reject the legacy of the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, this was the peace treaty that at the end of World War I that dealt specifically with Germany, and it was an incredibly punitive and humiliating treaty for Germany. It had stripped Germany of its military, demilitarized the border region between France and Germany, which many Germans saw as opening them up to threat from France. It had stripped Germany of some territory. It had forced Germany to accept full responsibility for World War I, and it had imposed these tremendous reparations on Germany for the cost of the war. So step two is going to be to reject this Treaty of Versailles. To kind of go back and undo everything that the treaty had done. And there are a few key places that we want to focus our attention as we talk about this, or as we kind of explore this. So this map shows you some of the territory, or some of the most important territory that was lost by Germany as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So you'll notice that in the west, they lose the territory of Alsace and Lorraine, and a little more of the border region to France. They lose some territory in the east in the creation of Czechoslovakia, and they lose territory in the northeast to the creation of Poland. So in 1933, they leave the League of Nations. So one of the first things that Germany does is to leave the League of Nations, because the League of Nations, remember, was this peacekeeping body, this international peacekeeping body that was designed to prevent war. So Germany leaves the League of Nations, which is kind of a very early announcement that they're not going to be playing by the same rules anymore. In 1935, Germany announced a plan to remilitarize the Rhineland, and the Rhineland refers to kind of this border region between France and Germany. You can see it on this map here. So in 1935, they basically just say, hey, we're not going to abide by the principles of the legacy of or the Treaty of Versailles as it pertains to the Rhineland. Remilitarization obviously requires a buildup of military strength, so they were ignoring that component of the Treaty of Versailles. And then in 1936, they move in and occupy the Rhineland. So we have kind of in the mid-1930s these very small steps, nothing big, nothing overwhelming, but these tiny steps that say, yeah, we're not going to play by these rules anymore. And they will kind of adopt this policy of what we might call aggression and appeasement, where they make a step, Germany makes a step, an aggressive step, and then they wait to see what the world's going to do about it. And in all of these steps, the answer is not a lot. The world doesn't do a lot to address these early steps into war. And so from that point, they would move on to step 3, which was to pursue something called Lebensraum. And Lebensraum, which means living room, breathing space, excuse me. So Lebensraum is this concept that the Nazis had, that Germany needed to be able to spread out. So this Volksgemeinschaft, this like-minded people's community that we talked about in the Nazi ideology video, this new Aryan nation is going to need to spread out, to have this living space that they could use to establish themselves or to kind of strengthen themselves in global politics. And most of this land, what they want to do is to take this land from what they saw as the inferior populations or the inferior people, namely of Eastern Europe, particularly from Slavic and Jewish territories. So, step 3 is going to be pursuing Lebensraum. And the very first thing that they do in pursuing Lebensraum focuses on the territory of Austria. So if you take a look at this circle, this purple circle on the screen, you will notice that sort of in the left of it, you can see Austria. Austria was an ethnically German territory. It had been part of the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't united with Germany in the late 19th century, but it did have a lot in common with Germany. Linguistically, historically, culturally. And so in March 1938, Nazi Germany and Austria form a strong alliance known as the Anschluss. So basically, Nazi Germany absorbs Austria. And, you know, this was a more aggressive action, but it was an action that was voted on by the Austrian people. It was approved by the Austrian people. And so many in the world said, well, you know, we can't tell Austria what to do. We can't tell Austria what to want. So it's not worth going to war over the Anschluss. And this perhaps emboldened the Nazis so that in September of 1938, they would invade a territory known as the Sudetenland. It was part of Czechoslovakia. And you can see the Sudetenland here. It's the kind of crescent-shaped portion of the Czechoslovakian state that was ethnically German. It had been taken from Germany in the creation of Czechoslovakia, and so it was kind of a sore spot, a point of contention between Germany and the rest of the world. So in September of 1938. Nazi Germany invades the Sudetenland and says they're taking they're taking their territory back. They are bringing Germans back together. And again, that doesn't seem like that big of a deal, you know. So, I mean, it raised some eyebrows, certainly, and the world responded by hosting what becomes known as the Munich Conference. And the Munich Conference was a meeting of leaders to discuss this German problem, or more specifically, the Nazi invasion of the Sudetenland. And at the Munich conference, we have a number of leaders, but it becomes most closely associated with British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who is quoted in the context of this Munich conference as having believed that he had secured, peace. So this is where the idea of appeasement comes from. And appeasement is generally used, the term appeasement is generally used to describe the idea of kind of giving someone what they want to avoid a bigger problem. And there's an element of that in the Munich conference. But there's also an element of, people beginning to realize that the Treaty of Versailles was, in fact, a damaging peace, that it was, perhaps a draconian peace, and that Germany had some legitimate grievances against the rest of Europe coming out of the Peace of Paris and the Treaty of Versailles. And so Chamberlain would attempt to negotiate with Hitler, would attempt to appease Hitler in order to avoid further war. It kind of boils down to this idea that Germany has some legitimate grievances. It's not worth another world war over, so let's see where we can compromise. So they reach a peaceable agreement, as you can see in these newspaper headlines, and Neville Chamberlain himself came out of the meeting arguing, "My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Go home and get a nice quiet sleep." In other words, Chamberlain comes out of the Munich conference believing that Hitler had been appeased, that what he wanted, the invasion of, or the reunification of Germany by taking back the Sudetenland, had been enough. But it wasn't going to be enough. Hitler would move beyond the Sudetenland to invade all of Czechoslovakia, and by September of 1939, he'd moved to invade Poland. And the invasion of Poland marks the beginning, the official beginning of World War II, as evidenced by these headlines. So, as of September of 1939, the world was officially at war. But they entered into a period known as the Sitzkrieg. This is kind of a play on words. One of the chief strategies of the Nazi military was something called the Blitzkrieg, and Blitzkrieg meant lightning war. I mean, it allowed the Nazi armed forces to move through Poland very, very quickly. Within about 6 weeks, Poland had fallen. And then, they enter into this period of Sitzkrieg or phony war, false war, where Europe is officially at war. Germany has expanded, and you can see in this map the steady expansion of Germany between 1933 and 1939. I'll give you just a minute to look at this. You can pause it if you need to study it a little more in depth. But as of September of 1939, the world was at war, and Germany had to decide what was next. What were they going to do? In fact, everybody was waiting on Germany to make a decision. They could expand south into the Slavic territories of southeastern Europe. They could expand east into the Soviet Union, or they could move west into the Low Countries and France. And so the country waited in early 1940 for a decision to be made, and we'll pick up there in our next video. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.